In addition to those announcements, we did have a malfunction with the fire alarm in the building this morning. If the fire alarm goes off, it is most likely a malfunction. We will let you know if it is an actual emergency. We apologize. Thank you.
Hey, oops, sorry. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Center for American Progress Action Fund. My name is Alan Yu. I'm the Senior Vice President for National Security and International Policy here at Cap Action. Happy February 14th, everybody. Thank you for taking some time out of your Valentine's Day to join us. I want to I want to call out a special happy Thanksgiving to my Valentine, my wife, Sharon. Thank you for coming. Thank you for spending your Valentine's Day with me. And thank you all for spending your Valentine's Day with us. I want to welcome Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi and Congresswoman Haley Stevens, the ranking and senior members of the respectively of the House Select Committee on the strategic competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. I think for purposes of brevity and making sure we get through the hour, I'm just going to call it the House Select Committee for the rest of the day. They're here to talk China and what a smart and confident China policy looks like from a democratic perspective. So China has succeeded, like few political and policy issues, to bring Democrats and Republicans together. The adversarial agenda, the economic, trade, investment, technology, and security challenges, China's aggression towards our regional allies and partners, including Taiwan, are some of the key drivers. But reasonable and sometimes unreasonable people have different takes on the nature of the threat and the right strategic and tactical responses. That's why it's important to have smart, strategic policymakers like Congressman Krishnamoorthi and Congresswoman Stevens occupying key decision-making roles to determine and to lead in making these strategic decisions. But it's also important to be informed by the general American public's perspective. So in September of 2023, National Security Action did a poll of American voters, Democrats, Republicans, and independents on attitudes towards U.S.-China policy. The results across all segments were a clear endorsement of smart diplomatic engagement with China rather than bellicose rhetoric and confrontation. NSA asked voters for the top 3 words to describe how they wanted the U.S. to be in its relations with China. At the top, smart, firm, strong, diplomatic. At the bottom, aggressive and confrontational. 78% of voters say our leaders should focus more on working to avoid a military conflict, while only 22% say leaders should focus more on preparing for one. We'll be curious about how the two members view the public views and how that influences the way that they approach these issues. So let me introduce our speakers. Congressman Krishnamoorthi has represented Illinois' 8th District since 2017. He's also breaking barriers as the first South Asian American to lead a congressional committee. That's just great. He wears multiple hats on Capitol Hill, serving as the ranking member of the House Select Committee and also serves on the House Intel and Oversight Committees. Congresswoman Stevens has represented Michigan's 11th District since 2019. Also the district that I used to live in when I was growing up. In addition to her position on the House Select Committee, she also sits on the House Science Committee, where she's the ranking member on the Research and Technology Subcommittee, and she's also on the House Education Committee. So looking forward to discussing with them the committee's important work on a smart, confident China policy, as well as their vision for democracy and stability in the Indo-Pacific that benefits the American public. A warm round of applause for our guest, please. So let me start out, Congressman Krishnamoorthi. Could you give us a little bit of a scoping of the committee's mission, its priority objectives, and some of the accomplishments that you feel best about?
Sure. Well, thank you so much. Hello. Okay. Thank you so much for having us, Alan, and thank you, Cap,
for hosting us in this beautiful space. And thank you to all of you for taking time out. So this is a committee that was created a little more than a year ago on I think a 376 vote tally, which normally doesn't happen anymore on anything of substance, I should say. But it did on this particular issue. And basically it was tasked with assessing the technological, economic, and military or national security risks associated with the competition between the US and the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and then basically coming up with recommendations on what to do about it. That was the mission. And so to his credit, then Speaker McCarthy, along with Leader Jeffries, came together and selected this committee. They are some of the most talented people in Congress. They have the pride and joy of Michigan. Haley Stevens on there. But, you know, that's the case even on the other side. There are a lot of serious people, intellectually curious people who are trying to work together to deal with some really vexing issues. I'll always remember the first meeting that we had. It was actually in this speaker's conference room, which is this enormous conference room in the Capitol. And then Speaker McCarthy sat at one end of the table. All of the members sat around that table. And in a very unusual thing, he had Hakeem Jeffries sitting right next to him. And the two of them directed the committee to basically do everything in a bipartisan fashion as much as you possibly can. And McCarthy said, look, if you want to practice politics, I've got committees for that. But if you want to get something done, this is that committee. So that's what we've been kind of tasked with. In terms of accomplishments, I'd say there are three accomplishments. One, from the outset, we made it very clear that this committee cannot engage in any kind of xenophobic or anti-Asian or anti-Chinese rhetoric or conduct, because that would immediately poison the dialogue and be kind of contrary to the spirit in which this committee was created. And indeed, a lot of Democrats had to fear that this was going to become something like the Trump bash Biden committee. So that was something that we managed to do from the outset. And I credit Chairman Mike Gallagher, and I'll take some credit in trying to set the tone in the right way. Secondly, we established a good relationship with the committees of jurisdiction, which actually have to usher the legislation that we would come up with through Congress, because we don't have original legislative jurisdiction. And then the third is we have some specific accomplishments that we can point to. Just recently, we passed out of the House a bill to basically end double taxation of Taiwanese investment income, which is really crucial, because if we want chips and science to actually succeed and to court more Taiwanese investments in the US, we need to avoid double taxation. That was a really big deal, and I think it's going to pass out of the Senate as well. Another is just, I was just coming on stage, and Naira, my communications aide and policy advisor, just reminded me that Alexander Mayorkas, who's also in the news for other reasons today, decided to take up our recommendation for stepped up enforcement actions with regard to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And we can talk about that more, but that is crucial if we're going to really try to combat the genocide that's happening in Xinjiang province against 23 million Uyghur people. We can talk about that more, but I'm glad that human rights is back on the agenda thanks to a big Democratic priority.
Thank you very much, Congressman Krishnamoorthi. In particular, commendation to the committee for what you were able to drive with DHS on the enforcement on the Uyghur Forced Labor Act. Those are really important things that are not only important, as you pointed out, on the economic competitiveness side, but clearly for what we want to drive on the human rights front in China. So thank you. I wanted to put a question to both of you. You're both national level, national security policymakers. Congresswoman Stevens, you're the ranking member on the Research and Technology Subcommittee. You're the co-chair of the Future of Work Task Force. Congressman Krishnamoorthi, obviously you're the ranking member on the China Committee, and you are a prominent leader on the House Intel Committee. And not only that, for each of you in your districts, there are districts where China policy equities matter to your constituents, business, universities, everyday consumers. So how do you bring those perspectives, your national security, national level perspectives, to what matters to the people that you're representing? I wonder, maybe Congresswoman Stevens, if you could start.
Sure. Not a hard question to answer coming from the automotive capital, not only of the country, but of the world. And one thing that was also very significant in addition to the numerous accomplishments that Ranking Member Krishnamoorthi mentioned is that we were able to bring a handful of committee members to Detroit for fact finding, for sit downs with our auto industry and our supply chain. COVID, as we all know, was a huge wake up call. When I got to Congress, part of my motivation, I keep thinking, I'll just follow along with Raja. He's been here for so long, then you're introducing him. He's been here 2 years before me, but that's how it goes here with these every other year terms. But part of that motivation was to tackle what we have faced as a country with underinvestment in R&D. And for a long time, for about 20 years, that was largely partisan. In fact, when I was sitting in a research lab working with NSF and NIST, budget cut proposals led to a headline from the Atlantic saying we're going to have a lost generation of scientific research in this country if those budget cuts go forward. Fast forward 3 years later, you have bipartisan willingness to invest in scientific research in this country that we saw on the Science Committee as we were doing the science part of Chips and Science. Now that was authorizing, but the wake up to that was in part, we've had COVID-19 that has exposed our weaknesses, exposed where we are with supply chain vulnerabilities, and we want to compete. And we realize that we're not going to be able to effectively compete as a country if we're not doing innovation. So coming from Michigan, where you have an auto industry that wants to what? Lead the moonshot of the 21st century in electric vehicle, zero emission vehicle proliferation. You have a large company called General Motors. Maybe you've heard of them. They're selling into China, and not just selling, but they manufacture there, and that's part of their profit margin. Every week I go and I visit with a manufacturer. This is the sanity project, I call it, okay? Because we deal with a lot of interesting things in Congress. I say, keep the finger on the pulse of the economic drivers of my district, of my state, and frankly, of our country. So I go and I sit down with these manufacturers. I call it Manufacturing Monday. But we're not doing smoke and mirrors, geeking out on the factory floor, learning what they make, what they do, and what their needs are. 9 times out of 10, to the smallest tool and die, to a large tier 1 supplier, they're what? Making all over the world. They've got a presence in China. They're exporting. They're reliant on these strategies here. So when we think about what the contextualization to competition means for this country, it cannot be a decoupling. Some of my automakers find they've made that choice not to sell into China. That's not my business to tell them where to sell and how to sell, but it's to recognize that as we innovate and as we manufacture here in the United States of America, we need to be able to do so across the world.
Well, I think that Haley's absolutely right, and kudos to her committee for getting the authorizing language with regard to the investment in science. The problem is the appropriation side hasn't necessarily come through, and I think that we can spend all hour talking about how appropriations are really where the rubber meets the road, and oftentimes the rubber doesn't meet the road when it comes to what we say we want to do and what we actually do. So this is actually one of the bipartisan recommendations that came out of our economic report. 24 members of the committee said we should fund NIST, we should fund NSF, we should fund basic science, applied science, and every science in between, because if we don't, we're not going to have, as Haley mentioned, the wherewithal to innovate. And that's something that we hear over and over and over again, even from private industry. We were just in Boston for a field trip to look at the biotech sector, which we can talk about more later. But that is something that is high on their minds, which is that if we don't keep investing in our capabilities, we're not going to be able to outcompete not just the CCP, but any other country in the world.
And let me just add to this, because the select committee was created after the passage of CHIPS and Science. And CHIPS and Science, and the CHIPS investment in particular, that grand investment, that approach to industrial policy, it begets the question of what else do we need to do to follow that framework? You took $52 billion and said, you know what? We innovated chips in the United States of America. At one point we were making, 30-40%. Now we're down to 12%. It's gone overseas. We're overly reliant. This is a national security issue. This is an economic security issue as well. How does that rubric of taking $52 billion and seeing the private sector come to the table and say, you know what, here's $200 billion of investment. I mean, this thing paid for itself in the first 3 months of being signed into law. And so with the committee and what we have now, in terms of, well, we're looking at grand competition and we're taking a bigger focus. This is an American 21st century, quarter 21st century approach to industrial policy that enables a competition platform in the wake of getting NAFTA renegotiated, by the way, USMCA, the strengthening of North American, Buy American channels across the world. And so we're going to continue to take a look at this on the select committee, but it's very unique to say that after we've done one, and we've heard it over and over again from stakeholders, that this is the right approach. So let's not be afraid to say Bidenomics, because it's working, and it's working in a place that I call home.
That's great. You raised some really interesting questions. We've come a long way as a country and as decision makers on this question about funding for basic science and technology. I mean, there were decades ago that was not a question. In the near recent past, there was some controversy. It seems like China has mobilized a little bit more agreement across parties to that. But I wanted to ask you, as you look at the China economic challenges, as you mentioned, Congresswoman Stevens and Congressman Krishnamoorthi, as a mobilizer, as a motivator for domestic action. We looked at, you discussed very clearly the opportunities that CHIPS are opening up, IRA obviously as well. We call it nominally the bilateral infrastructure law. I'd actually call it the Biden infrastructure law, really, because fundamentally it's that. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you're seeing as the next areas where we should be doing big investments. And are we going to get Republicans along? Because in those first three bills, there was either none or very minimal.
It depends. It depends on how we talk about this. So I do view this competition as a galvanizing force. It's almost like a Sputnik moment for focusing the mind on certain issues that have been languishing otherwise in Congress, but need to be acted upon if we really have any chance of outcompeting the CCP. I can talk about a couple other. So we had 150 bipartisan recommendations in the December report, and about a third or more were with regard to what I called investing in America, investing in our people. I'll just talk about a couple: fixing our legal immigration system, which is completely messed up. I think many of the people in this room get it. I'm an immigrant. I'm one of the few naturalized citizens in Congress. And so this is a very personal issue for me. But, you know, you can take H-1B, for instance. If you come on an H-1B visa from India today, it will take you 100 years to matriculate for a green card. I'm not kidding. That is really the statistic today. 100 years. That's how long the queue is to get a green card. And this repeats itself over and over and over again throughout the immigration system. But this is an area, by the way, where the Republicans, for the first time in a bipartisan fashion, said, we want to fix this. Okay? That never happens anywhere else in Congress. Another issue is upskilling our indigenous workforce for technologies of the future. You know, one of the things that probably you know already, 1/3 of Americans have a 4-year college degree, 2/3 do not, even today, 2/3 do not. For them, the only way we're going to be able to get them into a middle-class lifestyle is to make sure that they have the skills necessary to fill those jobs, those millions of vacancies that exist today, oftentimes in technologies of the future. Because if they don't, they're going to be left behind, and politically, they are going to become more and more resentful about the globalization which is happening as we speak, and which, you know, Donald Trump has made into a 4-letter word. And in terms of investments, I think that the Republicans on the committee and elsewhere are definitely interested in more investments, so long as we can also tie them to outcomes. There have to be outcomes, and we want to have transparency, and we need to be able to make it public-private partnerships, just the way that CHIPS and Science has been developed, to be able to leverage private and public capacity to achieve policy outcomes. But if we can do that, I think this competition provides an extremely fertile kind of platform for us to be able to move a lot of initiatives that are otherwise really struggling in other parts of Congress.
And that key word being strategy, right? That's the name of the committee, the select committee, strategic competition. And one of the things that has had a lot of cross functionality between our work on the select committee and the ongoing work of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee is that we actually do not measure for our technological progress as a country. So we use Australia's indicator on what countries are leading in key technology areas. And you've got China leading in 27 out of 34. So this is, you know, examples would be quantum or 5G and whatnot. And if you look at artificial intelligence, which has possessed the dialogue of Washington, D.C. and policymakers and think tanks, because it's another earth-shattering, global-changing technology that's going to hit all of our pocketbooks and our productivity as an economy, and it poses great potential, but also certainly some threat. We've had a lot of luck in the United States of America. We had Microsoft, who decided to, do a large investment in a man named Sam Altman, who then created ChatGPT. We've, as a committee, sat down. You've seen this with Alex Wang from Scale AI, another invested in entrepreneur. Venture capital in this country works, but it only goes so far. And so we've had some wake-up moments where we have not, in the last 15 years, allowed for carryovers with technology. Batteries is an example of that. And my automakers are waking up to that in Michigan. And it's not just the big household name automakers. It's also, frankly, our suppliers who are obviously looking to get their fair share of this and be a part of the revolution. And it's also startups who are trying to get qualified to sell in. And so when we look at successful public-private partnership models and the bipartisan push to say, we're not going to cede leadership. We're not going to just wait to get lucky and wait for the private sector to fill in. We've got to have a strategy. And that's what this committee is also putting forward. And I really have to applaud my ranking member here for his leadership on the workforce development side of this, because we've heard over and over again on immigration challenges, on this global race for workforce that we're in. I mean, of course, we're growing our own, and we need to do that. And we need to look at skills, and we need to look at the computer numerical controls and the welders and all the individuals who are going into those jobs. But we also need to retain talent. I share a border in my state with Canada. They've modernized. So they've got people getting degrees here in the United States of America who are going right over to Canada because they can't stay here and contribute to our innovation ecosystem. We've got to look at our systems across the board, folks, and bring them into the year that we are in, which is halfway through this decade, 2025, 80 years since the end of World War II. Yes, great post-industrial revolution story of World War II, but we've got to do that for the now. And that's how we win this competition, in my opinion, because I want to win.
That's great. And I appreciate the responses from both of you. CAP Action is really interested and committed in working with both of you and others in Congress to really think through how we can help to set up like the right political and policy conditions to leverage this focus on the future that's driven by the China challenge, to take a look at what are the big opportunities that we ought to be unifying to as a country and really driving an agenda. We've been in touch with your staffs and with other other parts of Congress to really lay out a vision, to be thinking about, what are the key things that we need to put out there for people to consider as we look forward this year, but then more importantly, what are the things that we're going to be doing in 2025? So we're really looking forward to being partners with you on that. So I wanted to turn to the security side. There's a lot of saber rattling on the Republican side on the China threat, and those are real. China's aggression against Taiwan, we've seen. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, the CAP issued a report on Taiwan's election and the Chinese interference and its implications, not just for Taiwan, but the things that we need to be thinking about our country as well. And so these are real concerns, not just for Taiwan, but also for the United States. There's the strategic and economic challenges that we talked about before, the Xi-Putin bromance, economic coercion, all of those things. But the NSA polling that we saw a little earlier says that, voters accept that China is a competitor. There's no question on that front. But they're not supportive, mainly, of escalating to a conflict. So, Congressman Krishnamoorthi, as well as Congresswoman Stevens, what are the right approaches given the spate of global challenges that we're all facing and limited resources?
Sure. Well, thank you. And Haley and I have a no limits partnership as well. So we're good. But look, I think that chart is an excellent chart. It says 78% of all voters, and it's roughly the same across each party. 78% of all voters want to work to avoid a military conflict with China. And we see that in poll after poll, by the way. So these results are roughly the same as what we see everywhere. But what does that mean? Interestingly, I think in this same poll, voters also think there's a majority of voters believe there's better than a 50-50 chance of a conflict, an open conflict between the United States and the CCP within the foreseeable future. So at the same time that they make this a very high priority, they also fear that this could boil over into a conflict. Now, where would that conflict arise? I think the place where it's most likely to arise is probably Taiwan or perhaps the South China Sea. And so that's why I think it's so important that we do what I think we've done on a bipartisan basis on the committee, which is how do we make sure that Taiwan has what it needs, consistent with the Taiwan Relations Act, which also obligates us to help them with acquisition of articles of self-defense, to make sure that they can deter a forcible reunification with the CCP, i.e. an invasion or something else that could spark a conflict. So that's why it's so important, I think, that we, and we have various specific recommendations on this in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, in terms of reforms that we need to make to help porcupine Taiwan, in essence. And we need to follow through on that. Now, what I like about the Biden administration strategy is that they're doing it, and they're doing it in a way that is a little more expeditious than previous administrations. I think they should do more of it, but they're also doing it at the same time that they hold high-level diplomatic dialogue with the CCP, and they've opened a military-to-military communications channel to avoid potential miscalculations or to deconflict areas where both we and the CCP have military assets in close proximity to each other. I'm really glad about that. You have to have both tracks operating simultaneously. All that said, I think this is a real challenge. It's not a figment of our imagination. Xi Jinping is unlike any other modern leader that we know of with regard to the PRC. He has said repeatedly that reunification with Taiwan is part of national rejuvenation. And he has said we cannot leave this for future leaders. President Biden has said, well, you should talk it out. This is not going to end well if it's forcible reunification. And so what we need to do is make sure that at the same time President Biden is saying that, we work with our friends, partners, allies, along with Taiwan, to deter conflict.
I think we're also in somewhat of a what the history books might describe as the "what the heck is happening here" moment, and I don't say that just in jest. We've got, since the beginning of this century, a wild trade imbalance. We have a country we buy a lot from that we can't sell as much into. We see our manufactured goods being tariffed and, being forced to invest in their country in the way that we don't require a reciprocity. We see our farmland being bought up, our food manufacturers being bought up. And then not only do we have this kind of economic imbalance, we have cyber threats, right? We have infiltration in with regard to the social media conversation with TikTok. We have a balloon that was flying over our skies, embarrassing our elected officials and causing issues, which, by the way, the resolution to condemn that was voted on unanimously in the Congress. It wasn't a partisan resolution, which, again, the former Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, said he wanted to send that message to the CCP. Now we also have been dealing with aggression and realities over the Indo-Pacific region and the Taiwan consideration. Democracy is in a beat up moment right now. We're beating ourselves up internally. We're allowing, in the global world, our competitors to sort of beat us up while they just kind of get away with genocide. I mean, where's the UN designation for what's happening to the Uyghurs? Well, we know what's going on with the UN. So our foundations are being challenged. America doesn't want to box itself out. We don't want to be standing in the corner waving a sword around alone. We've got this consideration coming from the Senate to the House of, are we going to invest in democracy? Are we going to stand by democratic allies? Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan. That's part of this competition here. Now, this graph, this polling result is absolutely a motivation, But I think part of this what the heck moment is, you go to support in Oakland County, Michigan and Madison Heights, you go to support your local police and you buy one of their t-shirts and what does it say? Made in America, not made in America. Oftentimes it says made in China. And that is dug in with my voters. That is what's sinking in, that there's this frustration that not only do we see t-shirt manufacturing over to China, but we've ceded too much manufacturing. And so I bring it back to the economics here because that's part of what is weakening our ability to push back on what could happen with Taiwan. Think about that. Where do you get not just an iPhone, but a smartphone? What happens, when we have a trade imbalance and find that, they have a lot of our debt that's their, that's kind of a weakness of the CCPs in some respects, in my opinion. But I constantly bring this back to economics as we're dealing with this threat and this reality. We can't continue to go along to get along and just expect that, WTO and we've got, a nice framework for trade here. Well, it hasn't been working out for my workforce in Michigan all too well. And yes, for those who've been able to invest and create production lines over in China, that's worked for them. But we got to figure out the trade, and how we do that, folks, is not poking the bear. We got to work with our allies. We've got a thing called AUKUS. So I'll stop there because there's a lot to say with Australia, UK, US. The first pillar being nuclear subs, and the second one being the technology apparatus. The next thing, I was talking AI, minerals, critical materials, they go into everything. We need to be able to have access in the United States of America. It's not going to be like chips where we can build it and have a complete supply chain. We have got to be able to friend shore. We have got to be able to work with allies in a smart and strategic way. We have got to get to India. We've got to keep India in our column and working with us and understand, fine, there's going to be uncomfortable bromances, but the free world has got to be continued to be run by free leaders, in my opinion.
Thanks very much. I'll make this the last question, and then I definitely want to open it up for other folks. Congresswoman Stevens, I think you're exactly right on the critical nature of allies and partners, and the Biden administration, I think, has just really gotten us off our back, frankly, from where we were 4 years ago. And it's really going to be critical, as we deal with the China
Alan, don't make me say the three letters, TPP.
Well, what I will say is that, that's the China challenge. It's also as we deal with challenges across the globe. But I guess the other question, that begs the question to me of, there are these global challenges that we're all grappling with. We're grappling with climate. We're looking at food insecurity at a global level, macroeconomic stability, growing debt problems in the global South. To solve those things, we gotta be at the table with China, right? I think that they're a critical player in this, if not a partner, critical player in this. I think it's in the U.S. interest for us to be there, engaging China to shape and influence how they approach these issues. Again, the NSA poll says, they want the United States to be smart, diplomatic, et cetera, in its engagement with China and in dealing with global challenges. But the Republicans criticize the White House for, what they call zombie engagement with China. Where do you both come out on this question, particularly on the challenge of climate action? Congressman?
Well, I think that we have no choice but to work with them. We just recently met with the deputy special envoys for climate from the Biden administration. And for the first time, they said they feel that the CCP is actually serious about working together on climate action. And they don't know why, but they feel that for the first time, they're able to talk about the fact that, together we account for about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. The CCP is about to announce, if they haven't already, their plans to reduce methane emissions for the first time. Now, Xi Jinping has made it very clear that they are not peaking their carbon emissions anytime soon. It's going to be, they're still building coal-fired plants in China at this point. So we have a ways to go. Now, the one thing we didn't talk about, which I think is maybe kind of the backdrop for what's happening with regard to the bilateral relationship and why I think there's room for us to grow the relationship constructively as the Biden administration is doing, is that the Chinese economy is tanking right now. And I use those words advisedly. You know, basically consumer confidence is crashing. They're on the verge of deflation in parts of China. They're already experiencing it. We haven't seen deflation on a major scale on any major economy for a long time. And they have 22 to 25% youth unemployment. So if you imagine because of the one-child policy, one child, two parents, four grandparents, all of whom invested all of their dreams, their aspirations, their resources into one person, and that one person graduates from college and doesn't have a job, they are pissed. They are absolutely upset. And you're seeing this in just grassroots sentiment, okay? Not to mention the fact that all of a sudden that property, that second property that everybody in China was asked to invest in and use as a kind of retirement savings asset has now declined in value by 50%, 40%, 60%. And you have a recipe for potential seeds of regime instability. This is where we come in. And this is where we say to Xi Jinping, and this is what I think the president's administration is saying repeatedly, which is, it's time that you work with us and the rest of the world to try to set things right. Because what has happened in China is partly a function of their own doing and their aggression, their economic aggression that they've been practicing against others, who in turn have adopted countermeasures that have also now been applied against China and that are really restricting them in different ways. And so that is the fundamental question that Xi Jinping has to ask himself, which is, do I grow this economy? Do I repair a problem which is festering in front of his own eyes? Or do I go down the control and national security route over and over and over again and play that card to the point where he really risks potentially the regime? And I think we should continually try to engage, try to convince them to go down the right route, and then hedge our risks and do the smart thing through strength, which we're doing right now.
I couldn't endorse that anymore. And
I
Alan,
approve that message.
yeah, I approve that message, truly, and particularly strength through power and this notion of dialogue, which you were spot on to bring up, Alan, in particular in terms of where we've seen President Biden take the relationship. And what's also evolved out of our vast, oversight type of hearings has really been this mode of, we're not doing acquiescence, we're not necessarily doing blind acceptance, but we're doing tolerance through hedging of risks, because we can't fully reject. So some of this is just recognizing and tolerating. There's an education piece here too, again, on freedom, again, on democracy, but also recognizing that each country, the United States and China, is going to have to do its own housekeeping. And it's refreshing to be able to say that here at the Center for American Progress, because you're looking at a host of policy issues here in this building and at this institution in a way that is very beneficial to those of us who are lawmakers who want to evolve our system. And I'm talking about basic domestic policy priorities. Climate, obviously, we're doing here. We realize we've got to do it for the world. Maybe making some money while we do it is going to bring others along. And, as China makes that choice about growing their economy or removing themselves from some of that leadership approach is going to play out. But I also see this as paid family leave, abolishing the death penalty in the United States of America, even adding like a new state to our union, which when we're in the majority, I'm saying this humbly.
Which states did you have in mind?
We're here in the District of Columbia, right? And some people blow off that debate, but yet that's part of the grand discourse of the institution Raja and I are privileged to serve in.
Yeah,
That sends a message,
Yeah.
that sends a message to do things like that. That's part of our own housekeeping. Democracy needs to work, can't just be economics.
That's great. And as a Ward 3 voter, I would love it if you could get us a member as well as a member as strong and visionary as the two of you. Thank you very much. Damn, that was a really great exchange. I really appreciate that. I think we've got some time for some questions. Let's go. Yes. Could you identify yourself? And then this is an opportunity for a question, not a statement.
Definitely, it's a question. My name is Yacha Wang. I'm from Freedom House. Both of you mentioned that retaining talent is very important for the competition, and of course, fix the immigration system, right? But it's also about creating trust. So the top Chinese scientist wants to stay in America, to work here and contribute to the country. So I've been talking to science from China who work here in the past several months, and they told me that increasingly they don't feel trusted and valued by their institution, their labs, because of the geopolitical background. And then I actually met a scientist in a huge lab in Illinois. I think he might be your constituency. He told me that I'm going back.
Does he like me?
I'm sure he does.
Okay.
He told me that I'm going back to China, where his family, he's from, where his family there. He said, I'm very worried that when I land in China, the intelligence is going to want to talk to me, wanted to know what I do in this lab. But I'm also don't trust the institution, the lab he works in the US enough to tell them that if this happened to me, I would tell them, because if I'll tell them, they're going to trust me and value me even less. So what can I do? That's a very practical question. So he asked me, and I'm passing this question to you.
Okay. Do you have any easy questions? Look, first of all, if I'm happy to talk to him directly, so you can contact me or you can through my staff. Secondly, this is a common issue, and it makes me sad to hear this every time I hear. But yes, a lot of Chinese origin researchers, Chinese students are under suspicion, or they feel that they are under suspicion. Now, let's be clear. There are certain individuals who have been tasked by the CCP with certain goals which are not consistent with what we would want to see, especially with regard to our national security. But we can't cast a wide net of suspicion and engage in precisely the type of persecution that we criticize other regimes for doing, right? So how do we deal with that? I think one is we have to be very communicative with our Chinese origin community, as well as our scientists and engineers, okay? We have to tell them, look, we understand that the regime back home uses transnational repression, sometimes to coerce people to do things that they don't want. We want you to talk to us first if you ever feel any such pressure, okay? Secondly, I think that we have to avoid things like the China Initiative. You remember the China Initiative? Disastrous thing that the Trump administration put in place, which my good friend Ted Lieu has really been crusading against and successfully. Basically, for those who don't know, basically the China Initiative in the Trump administration required that pretty much there was like a prosecution of virtually, anyone and everyone of Chinese origin who did anything that was remotely cause for suspicion on the basis of virtually no evidence. And repeatedly different jury trials and bench trials in the United States have shown that these were just persecutions. They were not prosecutions. And so we got to end that nonsense.
Congressman and Congresswoman, thank you so much for sharing your time and your insights this afternoon. My name is Ali Wine. I work at the International Crisis Group on the U.S.-China relationship. I wonder if you could give us a little bit of insight into how do we gauge success in this competition? We talk a lot about competing and out-competing, sort of competition to what end? So what does it mean to succeed? What does it mean to win? And where would you like to see the U.S.-China relationship? If we succeed, where would that relationship be in the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, I would define success in simple metrics. You could look at the refining of minerals and say, well, maybe we're going to see in 5 years, not 95% of refining of minerals that we purchase come from China. This is about having strategy. If we want to lead, we've got to pick the areas we want to lead in and be consistent. We cannot have frenetic leadership. And that's very important too. That's something I've very much appreciated from the Biden administration. I don't think this has been zombie. It has been very consistent and it has been open to transparency. But I think the economic indicators will absolutely be essential. Obviously, too, minimizing the trade deficit. That's another big motivator. We need to get something to rally around and then also work with our allies. We've got to look at the international agreements that we have in place and then think about how we can build off of them. In many respects, we're just getting started. I mentioned AUKUS with the technology pillar. That is just getting started. And there's others that we can bring on board as well. We've got a renegotiated NAFTA. Canada in particular is an essential partner for us here. So is Japan. And frankly, looking at the economic promise of India. And it's not to say, hey, we're boxing out China by any stretch of the means, but it's not being overly reliant. That's what's happened here, is that we have just become overly reliant to the point that it has led not only to voter ire and not ire to the sense of let's take up arms, but that our voters recognize that we're in this competition and they're frustrated by this. And we've also realized that in the United States of America, the innovation promise is going to continue to be key. Harnessing the capabilities of innovation. And what does that look like at the quarter 21st century to the year 2050? You know, it's not just Mark Zuckerberg working in his college dorm room. It is the entrepreneur, and I know many of these in the suburbs of Detroit, who are tinkering around in their garage and they're connecting to things like the Small Business Innovation Research Program through the NSF. And these are real stories that I could give you out of southeastern Michigan. So it's passing budgets that allow us to be consistent, to do what we do well, and to not necessarily repeat, I think, some of what we can reflect on from the early part of this century that hasn't necessarily led to the best results. And then also, let's continue to measure success by Taiwan having free and fair elections. Let's measure success by, really getting an understanding of what's going on in China's own economy. Google isn't invested there, but Disney World is. And it's very popular in China. That's soft indicators, but it's a point of promise in terms of these cultural exchanges. And, to your great question, and by the way, this is something we really work on the Science Committee. We can't sit here and have this China policy that President Trump put forward and not modernize our own immigration system. That's an irony. And that's a hypocrisy on the world stage. We need to be recruiting and retaining talent and making sure that we've got what's coming out of our universities that's going into the hands of entrepreneurs and our economy writ large.
Great. Let's take one last question from the audience as well as wrap up from there.
Yeah, thanks, Alan, for hosting us, and thank you both for your comments. My name is Alex Brenner. I work at Greenpoint Group, which is a strategic consulting firm focused on China exclusively. So the question for you is, what happens to this committee going forward, particularly if the Democrats win the House, which we hope will happen?
Then we will call Raja chairman.
Yes. So then, how would your might your approach differ? And if we've just heard the news about Chairman Gallagher, how, if Republicans continue on, how might that shift the committee's work? Thank you.
Sure. I think what we've learned from this committee is that if I can just address Ali's question at the same time, what's the measure of our success? I think another measure of our success is whether we as a country become a better version of ourselves at the end of the day. You can clap. That's cool. Do we fix our immigration system? Do we end up upskilling the people in southeastern Michigan and the 8th District of Illinois to take the jobs of the future? Do we invest finally in the science part of CHIPS and Science Act and have these world-winning discoveries that the government helped to seed? I'd like to focus more on that, someday for this committee. And I think the committee has been a galvanizing force in terms of bringing bipartisan attention on these issues. Now, are there Republican priorities as well that have been brought to our attention that we've supported? Yes, absolutely. I don't think, for instance, the R&D tax credit issue would have gotten the momentum it did as part of the tax extension package that passed, in part without our committee saying, hey, we got to fix this. Our small businesses and medium and large businesses need this to do the R&D necessary to compete with China. And so finally, we were able to get, by the way, let me just say that R&D tax credit deal also made it possible for us to get the child tax credit deal, right? It all kind of, yeah, you can clap. It all kind of comes together. So this committee is the spark plug. This committee is the spark plug for the congressional engine that has been sputtering for the last decade, and that could finally kind of hit on all cylinders, to use a Detroit metaphor. And it could actually get us moving in the right direction. And it could be a powerful antidote to Trumpism. It could be a powerful antidote to the kind of anarchic, dystopian craziness that we see that has taken a fever hold of the other caucus. And these 20 members, 24 members, we sit in a room, and oftentimes we're not even divided on partisan lines. Sometimes we have differences of opinion based on, we have 2 or 3 members from Michigan. They have a regional issue or concern. That's how Congress should be. It's got to be representative and not like some kind of weird kind of partisan cage match, which is what it is right now. So that's where I see the committee going. That's where I'd like to see us as a party take it. And I think we will. And CAP has done an excellent job of laying the groundwork in a lot of policy areas. I'd like to see us kind of start to move on those.
Well, we are in a really hard and complex and frankly, sometimes disturbing and distressing circumstance. But your last intervention does give us some hope. I mean, for good or bad, as we've talked about today, the China challenge has been a mobilizer and a catalyst for action and for some convergence of bipartisan action. And really, I think much of the accomplishment and the promise that we have here is really due to the great work that the two of you are leading. So thank you very much for that. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, and happy Valentine's Day.
All right. Thanks, man. Thank you. And happy Lunar New Year too. Thank you. Thank you.